Hi, this is Emily Freitag with Instruction Partners as part of our Rethinking Intervention series. I'm excited today to be talking to Jeff Wetzler at Transcend Education. And Jeff, we are just talking about what do we know about what works to accelerate student learning and what do we know about what does not work. And you have worked with schools in a variety of capacities and I know are steeped in a lot of research. And excited to hear your perspective on this as we try to understand different points of view. So let's start in a personal place. I'd love to hear from your own experience or from someone who you are close to, a little bit about the journey of learning and what that personal experience shapes and how you think about what it really takes to help students learn and to accelerate learning.
Sure. I think I'll talk about my daughter, Eden. She is now in 6th grade and so much fun. But I'll go back to a moment in time when she was in elementary school. I think this was something like 2nd grade that she was in. And we were having a parent-teacher conference with her teacher. And she wasn't doing that well in math. She was misunderstanding some of the concepts. She was falling a little bit behind. And it wasn't egregious, but it wasn't exactly where I think she and the teacher and everyone would want her to be. Mm-hmm. And in the context of the parent-teacher conference, the teacher said something to the effect of, she's just not a math kind of person. Mm-hmm. Like math isn't her thing. And of course, for my wife and I, as the parent of a girl, we were thinking to ourselves, she's only in 2nd grade and we're already identifying that she's not a math kind of person. And thinking about all of the, all the things that we know about stereotype threat and expectations for girls in math and science. And we basically said, we're not going to make that determination at this point in time. And I think there probably is something there that's more broadly applicable around expectations and around identity. And so we voiced some of that in the context of the conversation, and we talked that through. But one of the things that I decided to do was to figure out how's math going to be fun, and how are we going to get lots more practice and at bats, and it basically just additional time on task with math. So I just found an online program. At the time we used something called Dreambox. And my daughter and I would do it together in the evening. And one of the nice things about it is that we could start kind of where she was, and it would give her the 2 things that I think are most important in any kind of acceleration, which is practice and feedback. And she had lots of practice on problems, and when she got them wrong, she didn't get to move forward. She got the answer that she got the feedback that she got it wrong, and then it gave us a chance to talk about it. And then, and pretty soon she was just having fun with it, and it was really fun. And she looked forward to it, and we looked forward to the time together to doing it. And then after a while, it kind of got boring for her, and she didn't want to do it anymore. But by that point, she was kind of on track. But we found another one called Zern, and then she did Zern for a while too. And Zern is not typically meant for independent use outside the context of the classroom. But it had really good content and really good instruction, and because we were doing it together, we were able to make it work. And then that kind of took her and just like basically solidified it. And after a while, that got boring too. So I think there's probably interesting things about like persistence or whatever, but it was enough to get her on track, and she's never had that label as somebody who's not math or whatever. And now I think she would probably say that math is one of her favorite subjects. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
That's interesting. I hear in that a couple of interesting things. One is like the relationship that you and she together around the content, with some attention to joy, practice, feedback, and then expectations and identity.
Yes,
kind of all had to come together in that story. Interesting. Thanks for sharing.
I think about it from an equity perspective too, because how many students might be labeled as they're not a math kind of kid, or how many parents might just accept that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Because they might have been labeled that too. So
right, exactly. And so just thinking about what, the fairness and equity dimensions of that, I think are really sit with me too.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So take us now to, a bit of a broader view. You work with schools to help them really rethink school. And what research do you all lean on in that? And essentially, what do you feel like we collectively know about how to accelerate learning?
Yeah. So we lean heavily on research out of learning science. And there are 4 kind of bodies of research within that we spend a lot of time thinking about. One is research on cognition. One is research on motivation. One is research on identity development. And then lastly, research on individual variability. And so, from our perspective, these 4 bodies of research are just, deeply important in thinking through what matters in accelerating learning.
So talk us through each of them a little bit.
I'll talk us. Yeah, happy to. I mean, cognition is, essentially, at the most crude level, it could boil down to how do things come into working memory of someone, and then how does that get processed into long-term memory, whether content or skills or some blend of those things. And there are 5 or 6 principles out of cognition that we spend a lot of time thinking about, everything from focused attention to meaningful encoding to practice to feedback to metacognition. If I were to zero in on just a couple of them, and we can talk more about any of them and obviously share resources about any of them, but I think the 2 most important are practice and feedback. And practice is not just like do it as many times as you possibly can, but there's like a whole science underneath practice. Spacing it out in the right ways, practicing at the edge of your competence as opposed to practicing things that you already know well, or practicing things that you're not yet good at as well. Practicing not just to perfection, but beyond perfection. And then similarly, getting rapid feedback as well, and getting high quality feedback, and feedback that's not just about did you get it right or wrong, or even what was your reasoning for getting it right or wrong, but also feedback on the process that you used as well to get there. And I think great coaches in sports do this, incredibly well intuitively. Musicians, absolutely. But school typically, I think, is not designed to optimize for high quality practice and feedback. Often, I've just going back to my own kids, it's kind of like you turn in your work, you get a grade. But that does not often lead you to reflect on the process or say, let's do it again, etc. And I think, competency-based models of learning as opposed to time-based models of learning are better at that, because you don't advance and you don't move on until you actually have demonstrated the mastery that requires this kind of practice and feedback to be happening. But those are a couple things within cognition.
While we're in that zone for a second, one of the things we're exploring is some of the strengths and pitfalls of our mental models about learning and what that leads us to do and not do. And I do think one construct that a lot of educators have is more of a linear learning path. And, as you were talking about competency-based education versus time-based or seat-based, there's a lot in that, of course. But from your seat, what does the research tell us about sort of how linear or not linear learning is, and where the right gates to stop and hold the line until you can move forward might be?
I mean, I think probably very few things that involve human beings in the end are actually linear. And I think learning is no exception. I think if it were linear, then, theoretically, I would be able to remember the things I had learned in high school in chemistry class because I learned them, then they're in and I've got them. And I definitely cannot. And so I think we know that learning requires retrieval. It requires applying things in different contexts. It requires looping back and spiraling back to things. It requires making new and different kinds of connections. Maybe it's linear in the sense that there is knowledge that builds on prior knowledge, and there's skills that build on other skills. So in that regard, things do build up in a linear kind of way. But by and large, I think it's, it's more recursive than linear.
You think, what, if anything, have you seen about what doesn't work? And in particular, what do you see schools trying to do in the name of accelerating learning that might actually be in tension with any of the research about how learning happens?
Yeah. Maybe I will, you can still hear me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Maybe I'll use that as a opening to go into a couple of the other domains of learning science that I was talking about before.
Great.
So another domain is motivation. Motivation is all about starting, putting in the mental effort and persisting. I think that there's a lot of attempts to accelerate learning and catch kids up that don't tend to motivation, and that essentially work against what science knows about what motivates kids. At the highest level, we have seen there are four things that truly drive motivation. One is value. Kids actually have to value the learning and what they're doing, which comes back to relevance and a whole bunch of other things. Two is they have to have a sense of self-efficacy, which is that they believe that they can master it. Third, and this is, I think, maybe one of the ones that is often most either valued or not violated or not tapped into, which is that they need to have a sense of control over it. If they feel as though it's being done to them, that will undermine motivation, versus if they feel like they're actually in control of it in some important ways, that will tap into motivation. And then lastly, there's just the affective or emotional dimension of motivation, which is that there has to be constructive emotions, which doesn't mean that they're never stressful or struggle or anything like that. But there has to be some sense of, joy and positivity in it as well, for motivation to happen too. And so I think that, like, the classic mistake is just the brute force, we're going to drill and we're going to do this and we're going to get over it or whatever. And I think that can, sometimes that works, oftentimes that doesn't work. But in either case, it fails to tap into what I think might be one of the most important sources of strength that our kids have to catch up and accelerate at this moment, which is their own agency and motivation. And if we can create interventions that literally honor those four principles of motivation, I think our kids will catch themselves up, because they're going to be so damn driven to doing it, as opposed to we're going to have to do that. And so to me, the biggest mistake that's made is to ignore that and to try to do it to the kids, as opposed to unleash the motivation in the kids to do it.
I love that. They're going to catch themselves up if we tap into their own motivation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jeff. What else? What else should we be thinking about as we collectively in education think about the task ahead of accelerating learning for many, many students?
Yeah. The two other domains, maybe this will just be good to kind of close on these. One is identity development. And so similarly, I think that, maybe it comes back to the story with my daughter, that there's a ton of research on stereotype threat. There's a ton of research on kids needing to feel safe in their identity, affirmed in their identity, etc. And if we simply try to take on intervention agnostic to kids' own identities, we will cut them out of the process. And their identity development is such an important part of the learning anyways. And so we can probably have a whole conversation about that. And then the last dimension, maybe, which I think might be the most provocative, is this whole question of individual variability. And there, as I'm sure there's a whole science of individuality, and Todd Rose is one of the the leading thinkers in that. Books like The End of Average and so on, which I think at their deepest core probably call into question concepts of grade level readiness, because underneath the concept of grade level readiness is, I think, a premise that kids who are the same age should all be at the same level in every subject that they're in. And I think the science of individuality would tell us that's maybe bullshit. And yet we set up schools in ways that kind of put ourselves in a position to say, we've got to do that. And I think that not only holds kids back who are behind, but also actually holds kids back who could race ahead as well. And it's not the same in different, it's maybe different in different subjects for different kids. And so I think like, at the most profound level, if we want to really think about what does it mean to accelerate learning, we do need to call that concept into question. And I don't say that lightly, because I know that looking at grade level readiness and performance is so important in terms of dimensions of equity and civil rights. And we know what happens when we don't do that and who gets left behind. So it's super tricky. But ultimately, I think that's one of the biggest questions we need to wrestle with as a field.
Jeff Wetzler, thank you so much for this conversation. I am taking away so much about ideas of motivation and how important they will be to intervention, and some provocative ideas about how school is in tension with what we know to be true in a lot of ways, but that we do know a lot that we can be leaning on in this time.
Thank you so much for the conversation. I can't wait to see or read or watch the whole series. It's me thinking, so I really appreciate the chance to talk.